Kids in the dark. Growing up poor in the deep south means sharing a lot with my little brother, Ollie, most often with past toys, clothes, and skin conditions between us. Up until he was 6, we even shared a bed. Neither of us was happy about it. It was my 10th birthday when that changed. I got one present that year, and it was a bed of my own. Ollie was jealous right away, and I couldn't understand why. He had to keep that half broken down frame with the worn out mattress. The one I'd gotten wasn't much better. Not being broken and worn was enough. Sleeping apart was a great feeling. It was freedom. No longer would I have to suffer the sudden inexplicable kicks to the stomach. No longer would I wake up with Ollie's foot pressed into my neck like he'd stepped on Dracula the night before. At least that's what I had thought. Right away, right after I got the new bed, the shriek started. At first, I thought Ollie wake up in the middle of the night and screamed because he'd gotten scared. Then the sound echoed to the tiny room again, and I knew it wasn't a normal cry. The room was always black as pitch after sunset. The one window we had was pressed against a long leaf pine, and even the biggest, brightest moon cast no light inside. The shriek just about drove me crazy. Every night, probably at the same exact time, these sharp yelps would knock me right out of my dreams. It wasn't my mom or dad yelling either. I knew what that sounded like, believe me. Most worrying of all was the fact I could never tell where it was come from. It seemed completely random. One night it would come up from somewhere near the closet. The next, it shot out from a corner of the ceiling. Any hope I'd had of having my own space would get dashed every time Azali would silently slip into the bed with me, shaking like crazy. He'd clasp onto me and wouldn't let go until it was almost daybreak. Most times, I'd take his hand and tell him everything was going to be okay, that it would be over by morning. But I was never really sure. Over time, the shriek started changing. At first, it was only by a small degree, but eventually, it took on the primal hooting sound of a primate calling out its fierce warning. I had to clasp pillows to my ears just to keep from going deaf. Mom and Dad never believed me or Ollie because the thing, whatever it was, refused to make a peep when they were in the room. Apparently, they couldn't even hear it through the walls, even though it was damn sure loud enough. The shriek just got worse and worse, until I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. Me and Ollie were doing really bad in school, and we just had no energy at all. I could sleep more deeply with my head propped up and my eyes open in the middle of the class than in my own room at night. Then, thankfully, we moved out of the house nearly a year later. I had contemplated all sorts of things, even a child clumsy concept of suicide to get away from that horrific nightly noise. There was no problem at the next house. It was nice, white cookie cutter home on a dead end street, and I welcomed the normalcy. What's more, when we moved in, there was a bunk bed waiting for me and Ollie. No more broken bed, no more second bed. I'd ended up having to share it anyway. The only problem was deciding who'd get the top bunk. I told Ollie I deserved it. After all, I had gotten a new bed way back, and he ruined it by cleaning it every night. What? He shook his head. I never did that. I had always wondered why the noise stopped the second I was sharing my bed. Now I had the answer. The Onarophage. In the late 40s of the last century, after a decade of private research involving experiments with binaural brainwave frequencies, extrasensory recognition, and rare extracts of a South American vine, Dr. Thomas Ronners perfected a technique whereby one could actually intrude into the psyche and see another's thoughts. Despite having exhaustively documented his rigorous work, he could find no institution that would even offer to review it. Forced to sell his invention, He found by word of mouth among those through whom he procured narcotics a prospective buyer. The bête noire of an old New York family, Mr. John M. Dunn, a voyeuristic connoisseur of the supernatural and the obscene, who had squandered his idle youth in the great libraries of Paris, those catacombs of departed authors rummaging amongst the hordes of dirty and obsolete works. A literary ghoul who stabbed with profane fingers the charnel houses of decayed philosophies. He readily agreed to the doctor, asking price without haggling, delighted at the prospect of exploring such bizarre novelty. Once adapted at the operation of the apparatus, Dunn paid Dr. Rosner off and under an assumed name rented a shabby house with a view of Sing Sing prison. In the timeless night, while the convicts fitfully slept, with the aid of a set of stolen blueprints and his new mind reading device, he read their memories cell by cell, at liberty to savor the forbidden thrill of theft, molestations, moonlight homicides, and secret, without remorse or consequence. Within a month, the prisoners, telling each other about the nightmare from which they had all begun abruptly to awaken, discovered they shared strikingly similarities. First, processions of alligator and tortoises flew through a swamp crowded with faceless people and shrieking urchins. Next, a shadow man, at whom they looked directly, but could never quite see, would watch them in utter stillness from an empty house while invisible hands probed behind their eyes as they had to stand naked, legs locked in place, unable to run away. Their compared description of the house were identical, including its location just outside the walls. By mutual agreement, it was planned that the first of them would receive parole or be released would search this house out to find if it really existed and investigate the source of their troubling dreams. A few days after being freed, their chosen spy was able to inform them with a smuggled message in code that not only was the house real, but he had broken into it at night and found a gaunt, mustached man in a silk smoking jacket, seated bolt upright, head thrust back, both eyes gaping, mouth sucked open as a stiffened gasp, clenched hands gripping the arms of his chair in front of a scientific machine. A handwritten journal on the desk told the whole story of his adventures, prying unconstrained through their psyches, plundering the haunted memories of criminal after criminal, seeking even more shameful and audacious experience, until finally he wrote, on July 7th, of his overwhelming desire to witness telepathically the next execution in this prison's notorious electric chair. It started as a leak. The rainy season began in early summer, and June had been no exception. It did not surprise the man when he discovered rainwater dripping from his dining room ceiling. Shrugging it off, he placed the towel pot beneath the leak and expected it to stop on its own. However, it continued to rain, and before he knew it, the pot would threaten to overflow. He had to dump the water out first thing in the morning and straight after he returned home from work. Eventually, he began to notice water damage at the source of the leak. The white ceiling had discolored, turning a dull shade of brown. He checked the weather and realized that it would continue to rain sporadically over the next 10 days. The man was worried about the ceiling mounting and becoming an expensive repair, so he called a handyman. Fortunately, the man could not sign to have the repairs done. Only his landlord could. It was a frustrating policy. The man called his landlord, but could not reach him. He left him a few voicemails detailing how the damage was becoming progressively worse. The man was clueless as to why his landlord would not return his calls. They usually kept in touch, speaking at least twice a month. Finally, he reasoned that he would not be held accountable for any damages sustained. One night, the man was startled awake by a massive thump. He quickly turned on his bedside lamp and just vaguely He could see an overturned table and a large shape laying across it. He sprinted out of his apartment and called the police, gagging at the smell. The man sat in the police station with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a coffee mug resting in his hand. He did know one thing. There had been a dead body in his ceiling, and the water had saturated it so badly that it caved under the weight. So far, the body was unidentifiable due to the rainwater and was being autopsied. While the man waited, he called his landlord and finally reached him. Panicking, he explained the situation. His landlord was just as alarmed, and the man pleaded for him to come to the station while he made his statement. The man paused as the detective crossed over him, and he lowered his phone, wondering if the body had been identified. His blood ran immediately cold, and he shook his head with terror. The body belonged to Richard Thompson, his landlord. He had died over a year ago. That's not what disturbed him the most. If his landlord was dead, then who was pretending to be him? I sat on the bus. I sat on the bus on my way to school, listening to music and paying little to no attention to the other students. At one of the stops, my mind snapped back to reality. I looked towards the small house. Tommy's house, I thought. My hand slipped to the drapes of the window and waved the bus driver to move on. He's sick, I thought, paying no large amount of attention to the situation. The day flew by. I watched the local news channels after school, and what I heard paralyzed me. Tommy's entire family was murdered that day by an unknown suspect. After hearing this news, I moved back up to my room and quietly fell asleep. Next day, I sat on the bus. We drove past Tommy's house, and the bus driver, unaware of Tommy's family's fate, stepped at his home. As I was about to get up and explain to her what happened, something caught my eye. A pale hand slipped through the drawers of the window and waved the bus driver to move on. I sat on the bus, terrified. Seaweed. My grandmother grew up in the slums of Prohibition era Chicago. Her family lived in a small house near the harbor, and one of her earliest memories was of a particularly hot summer when, seeking respite from the heat, she and her sister discovered a seldom used section of a boardwalk near an abandoned warehouse. Every night, for several weeks, the two girls would make their way down to the docks and sit together on the edge of the pier as the sun went down. My grandmother vividly, and for a time fondly, recalled the feel of the seaweed between her toes as she and her sister dangled their feet into the murky water. It wasn't until years later that she returned to the pier and found that the warehouse had been demolished. Curious, she made an inquiry with the Department of Planning and Development. Apparently, the warehouse had been owned for a time by the mob, who was using it as a base of operation for a local prostitution racket. It had only been uncovered when an associate began disposing of rival hookers by fitting them with concrete shoes and dumping them into the harbor. Investigating officers had recovered recently 2 dozen bodies from the water of a secluded pier nearby. How had the bodies been discovered? Passing fishermen spotted some of the victims' hair floating near the surface of the water, like seaweed.